Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is David Riyamura, and 18 months ago, I never would have believed that maps could be weapons, or that the spaces between coordinates could hunger. I was a senior cartographer for the United States Geological Survey, specializing in boundary verification and cadastral mapping for federal land management agencies. For 12 years, I'd spent my professional life translating the physical world into precise digital representations, reducing mountains and valleys and watersheds into layers of vector data that other people use to make decisions about resource extraction, conservation easements, and indigenous land claims. The work was meticulous, demanding, and utterly grounded in empirical reality. I measured things. I documented elevations and declinations. I created truth from terrain, and I was very good at it. The morning I received the Howling Creek assignment, I was sitting in my cramped office on the third floor of the Denver Federal Center, drinking my second cup of coffee and reviewing a set of aerial photographs from a routine survey of Bureau of Land Management holdings in northwestern Montana. My supervisor, Margaret Castellanos, knocked once on my door frame before entering, which was her way of observing formality while making it clear the visit wasn't optional. She was holding a manila folder with a red tab on the edge, which meant expedited processing, and her expression carried that particular blend of bureaucratic concern and administrative inconvenience that I'd learned to recognize over the years. "David, I need you to take this one," she said, setting the folder on my desk with more care than a simple stack of paper warranted. "It's a boundary resurvey for a land exchange in eastern Oregon. The regional office has been trying to finalize the paperwork for 8 months, but there's a discrepancy in the legal description that's holding everything up." I opened the folder and scanned the project summary. The parcel in question was roughly 4,700 acres of mixed terrain in a remote section of Malheur County, part of a proposed swap between the Bureau of Land Management and a private ranching corporation. The legal description referenced survey monuments that had been established in 1889 during the original General Land Office survey, but the coordinates provided in the historical documents didn't align with modern GPS readings. The discrepancy was significant, nearly 300 meters in some locations, which suggested either dramatic geodetic drift, which was impossible, or errors in the original survey, which was uncomfortably common in 19th century frontier mapping. "How long do I have?" I asked, already noting the names of the section corners I'd need to locate. The south quarter corner of section 14, the meander corner on the west boundary of section 23, and something called the Witness Tree Marker near the confluence of Howling Creek and an unnamed tributary. 2 weeks for field work, another week for the report and certified plat, Margaret said. "The helicopter's already scheduled. You leave Tuesday." That should have been my first warning. The USGS didn't typically authorize helicopter transport for routine boundary surveys, not with our budget constraints, but I was too focused on the technical challenge to question the logistics. Resolving historical survey discrepancies was exactly the kind of forensic cartographic work I enjoyed most. It required combining archival research, field investigation, and geodetic analysis to reconstruct the decision-making of cartographers who'd worked before satellites, before electronic distance measurement, before even reliable magnetic declination tables. I spent the weekend preparing, downloading historical survey plats from the Bureau of Land Management's database, studying geological survey maps of the region, and reviewing the original surveyor's field notes from 1889. The surveyor's name had been Elias Thornton, and his handwriting was surprisingly legible for the period, neat, precise letters that suggested careful attention to detail. He'd worked for the General Land Office during the final wave of Western cadastral mapping, part of the enormous federal effort to impose a rectangular grid onto landscapes that had never been designed for geometry. Reading his notes, I could sense his frustration with the terrain. The area around Howling Creek was apparently a nightmare of volcanic badlands, steep ravines, and unstable soil that made it difficult to establish permanent monuments. He'd written multiple marginal notes about delays caused by weather, equipment failures, and what he described as peculiar atmospheric conditions that render the compass unreliable and disturb the natural order of observation. That phrase stuck with me, the natural order of observation. It was an odd way to describe survey work, which was fundamentally about imposing order through observation. But I filed it away as Victorian-era verbosity and continued my preparation. The helicopter dropped me at the site on a Tuesday morning in late September. The pilot, a contract worker named Rodriguez who'd flown for the USGS on dozens of previous surveys, seemed unusually quiet during the flight. He kept checking his instruments and glancing at the landscape below us with an expression I couldn't quite read, not quite concern, but something adjacent to it. When we landed on a relatively flat section of high ground about 2 miles from the first survey monument I needed to locate, he helped me unload my equipment more quickly than usual. "You've got the sat phone?" he asked, checking the fasteners on my equipment cases for the 3rd time. "Standard issue," I said, patting the bulky handset clipped to my belt, "and the GPS beacon for pickup." "Right." He stood there for another moment, hands on his hips, squinting at the horizon. "The weather's supposed to hold for your 2 weeks, but this area gets these sudden fog banks sometimes. If visibility drops, don't try to navigate. Just stay put and call for extraction." "I've worked in worse," I assured him. I had too. I'd done boundary surveys in Alaska in the Aleutians, where weather could shift from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. Eastern Oregon in September seemed comparatively benign. Rodriguez nodded slowly, then climbed back into the helicopter. I stood clear as the rotors spun up and watched the aircraft rise into the pale blue sky and arc away toward the west. The sound of the engine faded quickly, absorbed by the vast silence of the landscape, and then I was alone with my equipment, my maps, and approximately 32 square miles of surveying to complete. The first thing I noticed was the quality of the light. It had a peculiar flatness that made it difficult to judge distances accurately, the kind of atmospheric condition that happens sometimes in high desert environments when the air is exceptionally dry and clear. The sun was bright and warm on my shoulders, but the shadows cast by the scattered junipers and sage brush seemed somehow diluted, as if the darkness itself was being thinned out and spread across too much area. I'd seen similar effects in other arid regions, so I made a note to adjust my time estimates for traversing between survey points. Depth perception issues could easily add 20% to travel time. I spent the first 3 hours establishing my base camp and conducting initial reconnaissance of the area. My temporary station consisted of a lightweight tent, a camp stove, and a series of equipment cases containing my survey instruments, a robotic total station for precise angle and distance measurements, a dual-frequency GPS receiver for coordinate determination, and a metal detector for locating buried survey monuments. I also carried copies of the historical survey plats, Thornton's field notes, and geological survey maps of the region, all sealed in waterproof cases. The landscape around my camp was exactly what the maps had suggested: a broken terrain of volcanic outcrops, shallow ravines, and scattered vegetation. The soil was a reddish-brown color, sandy and loose, punctuated by darker patches of basalt that protruded from the ground like the exposed bones of some enormous buried creature. To the north, I could see the deeper cut where Howling Creek flowed, or should have flowed. According to the topographic maps, the creek maintained a small perennial flow even during the dry season, but from my elevated position, I couldn't see any evidence of vegetation that would indicate a water source. I decided to tackle the easiest survey point first, the south quarter corner of Section 14, which according to Thornton's notes was marked by a sandstone monument with a brass cap. The coordinates he'd recorded in 1889, adjusted for magnetic declination and converted to modern datums, should have placed it approximately 3 miles northwest of my camp. I loaded my GPS receiver, metal detector, and surveying equipment into my pack, checked the charge on my satellite phone, and set out across the basin. Walking across the landscape felt oddly dreamlike. The flatness of the light persisted, creating a sense of uniform distance where near and far objects seemed compressed onto the same plane. I kept having to check my GPS to verify my progress, because my visual estimation of distance traveled was consistently wrong. What appeared to be a 20-minute walk to a distinctive rock formation actually took 45 minutes, and when I arrived, the rock was simultaneously exactly what I'd expected and somehow different in ways I couldn't articulate. The shape was right, the color was right, but the presence of it felt wrong, as if I was looking at a very precise copy rather than an original object. I shook off the feeling and continued north. The terrain grew gradually more broken as I approached the area where Thornton's coordinates indicated the section corner should be. The ground began to undulate in low swells, and the vegetation became sparser, replaced by patches of bare soil and scattered fragments of basalt. I stopped every few hundred meters to take GPS readings and compare them to my map, and each time I did, the discrepancy between Thornton's coordinates and my actual position grew larger. By the time I reached the approximate location of the section corner, the discrepancy had grown to nearly 400 meters, worse than the initial reports had suggested. I spent the next 2 hours conducting a systematic search pattern, using the metal detector to scan for any buried survey monuments within a 500-meter radius of Thornton's coordinates. The device registered the usual background noise, scattered fragments of ferrous minerals in the soil, the occasional aluminum can from more recent visitors, but nothing that resembled a brass survey cap. I was about to expand my search radius when the metal detector gave a strong, clear signal. I knelt and began carefully excavating, removing the sandy soil in controlled layers the way I'd been trained. 6 inches down, my trowel struck something solid. I brushed away the remaining soil and found myself looking at a sandstone monument, roughly 8 inches square and 2 feet long, with a badly corroded brass cap set into its top face. The cap was stamped with letters that were barely legible, but I could make out enough to confirm it. GLO 1889 S a quarter S14. But something was wrong with its position. According to my GPS, the monument was 387 meters southwest of where Thornton's coordinates indicated it should be. That kind of error wasn't just unusual, it was nearly impossible. Thornton would have established this corner using a surveyor's compass and chain, taking careful celestial observations to determine true north and measuring distances with steel chains that were regularly calibrated. Even accounting for the limitations of 19th century technology and the magnetic declination differences between 1889 and the present, the error should have been measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. I photographed the monument from multiple angles, recorded its exact coordinates, and took detailed notes about its condition and setting. Then I set up my total station and conducted a series of observations to nearby points, building a local coordinate system that I could tie back to my base camp and the other monuments I'd need to locate. The work was routine, methodical, exactly the kind of careful measurement that I'd done hundreds of times before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the monument's position was fundamentally wrong in a way that transcended simple measurement error. The sun was beginning to drop toward the western horizon by the time I finished my observations. I checked my GPS and confirmed that I had enough daylight to return to camp, then began packing my equipment. That's when I noticed the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The landscape around me was completely silent. No wind in the sparse vegetation, no insects, no distant bird calls. Just a profound, encompassing quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical force. I stood motionless for a moment, listening to nothing. The silence had weight and texture, and it made me acutely aware of my own breathing, the rustle of my clothing, the faint mechanical sounds of my equipment. I told myself it was just the isolation, the natural quiet of an uninhabited landscape, but some deeper instinct suggested otherwise. The silence felt deliberately maintained, as if something was actively suppressing sound rather than simply existing in its absence. I started walking back toward camp more quickly than I'd intended, trying not to let my imagination transform a peaceful landscape into something threatening. But I couldn't stop myself from glancing back over my shoulder every few minutes, checking to see if anything had changed in the terrain behind me. Nothing ever had. The volcanic outcrops and scattered vegetation remained exactly where they'd been. But the checking behavior persisted anyway, driven by some unconscious awareness that something about the landscape was observing me in return. The walk back to camp took longer than it should have. I kept consulting my GPS, convinced that I'd somehow gotten turned around despite following a straight line bearing back to my starting point. The coordinates on the receiver showed that I was making steady progress in the correct direction, but the landscape around me seemed to repeat itself in subtle ways. I'd pass a distinctive juniper tree with a forked trunk, then 20 minutes later encounter what appeared to be the same tree in a slightly different location. A basalt outcrop with a particular weathering pattern would appear on my left, disappear behind me, then reappear ahead and to my right, as if the landscape was shuffling itself while I walked through it. By the time I finally saw my camp in the distance, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and the light had shifted into that long, shadowless dusk that happens in high desert environments. My tent was exactly where I'd left it. My equipment cases were undisturbed, and everything appeared completely normal. I set down my pack, started my camp stove, and heated water for dehydrated soup while I reviewed my notes and photographs from the day. The discrepancy in the monument's position bothered me more than it should have. I pulled out Thornton's field notes and read them again, looking for any clue that might explain the error. His descriptions of the terrain matched what I'd observed: the volcanic outcrops, the sparse vegetation, the quality of the soil. But buried in his notes about establishing the section corner, I found a passage I'd overlooked during my initial review. September 17, 1889. The observations at this corner proved most troublesome. The compass readings vary by as much as 15 degrees depending on the time of day and the position of the observer. My assistant, Mr. Davies, reports feeling unwell and experiencing disorientation. I myself have noted unusual difficulty in maintaining a steady bearing, as if the landscape resists the imposition of coordinates. The local Indians, when questioned about this area, become reticent and suggest it is better left unmapped. They call it the place where directions fail, though they will not elaborate on this name. Despite these difficulties, I have established the corner as accurately as conditions permit and recorded the necessary observations for the permanent record. I read the passage 3 times, trying to parse Thornton's meaning. The place where directions fail was evocative but not especially helpful, and the comment about compass readings varying by 15 degrees was concerning. That suggested either massive magnetic anomalies in the underlying geology, which should have been documented in subsequent geological surveys, or equipment failure, which an experienced surveyor like Thornton would have recognized and noted explicitly. I checked my own compass, comparing its reading to the GPS-derived bearing back to the section corner I'd located. The compass showed northwest. The GPS showed southwest. The discrepancy was approximately 90 degrees. I stared at the 2 instruments for a long moment, then checked them again. The results were the same. My compass, which I'd tested that morning at camp and found to be functioning correctly, was now showing a bearing that was perpendicular to the actual direction. I tried moving to different positions around my camp, thinking I might be near some localized magnetic anomaly, a large deposit of magnetite or basalt with unusual magnetic properties. But the error persisted regardless of where I stood. I marked the discrepancy in my field notes, made a note to check all compass readings against GPS bearings for the remainder of the survey, and tried to ignore the implications. Magnetic anomalies happen. They were rare in surface-level surveys, but not unheard of. The fact that Thornton had noted similar problems in the same area simply meant the anomaly was persistent, probably caused by some large-scale geological feature in the underlying bedrock. That's what I told myself as I finished my soup and prepared for sleep. It was a reasonable explanation, grounded in empirical observation and consistent with known geological phenomena. The fact that it didn't quite account for the specificity of the error exactly 90 degrees, rather than some more random deflection, was something I chose to file away as an interesting detail to investigate further once I'd completed the primary survey work. I slept poorly that first night. The silence I'd noticed earlier persisted, creating an acoustic void that made every small sound I made, shifting in my sleeping bag, breathing, the creak of the tent fabric, seem unnaturally loud. At some point deep in the night, I woke with the conviction that someone was standing just outside my tent, but when I unzipped the door and looked out, I saw only the empty landscape illuminated by a thin crescent moon. The darkness between the scattered plants and rock outcrops seemed thicker than it should have been, almost textured, but I attributed this to my eyes not being fully adjusted to the low light. I returned to my sleeping bag and lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence and trying not to think about Thornton's description of the compass problems or the strange repetitive quality of the landscape during my return hike, or the way my compass now pointed in a direction that was precisely perpendicular to reality. These were all explainable phenomena. They had to be. I was a scientist, a cartographer, a person whose entire professional identity was built on the foundation of empirical measurement and rational interpretation of data. The landscape around me was behaving strangely, but landscapes couldn't actually behave. They were static features, subject to slow geological processes, but fundamentally stable from day to day and year to year. If my observations suggested otherwise, the problem was with my observations, not with the underlying reality they attempted to measure. I repeated this reasoning to myself like a mantra until I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke to find my compass pointing in a completely different direction. The previous night, it had indicated northwest when the actual bearing to the section corner was southwest, a 90-degree error. Now, consulting the same compass from the same position, the needle pointed southeast, which was approximately 180 degrees from the correct bearing. The compass hadn't gradually drifted during the night. It had jumped to a new, equally wrong orientation, as if it was measuring some property of space that changed in discrete increments rather than continuous variation. I spent an hour testing the compass with every diagnostic technique I knew. I checked for nearby metallic objects that might cause interference. I verified that the needle moved freely and wasn't physically obstructed. I compared it to the backup compass in my equipment case and found that both instruments showed identical readings. I even disassembled the primary compass and examined its components for signs of damage or contamination. Everything appeared normal. The compass was functioning perfectly. It was just pointing in a direction that bore no relationship to magnetic north. I documented everything carefully, taking photographs and detailed notes, then made a decision that I would spend the rest of the survey relying exclusively on GPS for navigation and treating the compass as a diagnostic tool for measuring whatever magnetic anomaly was affecting the area. It was a reasonable adaptation to challenging field conditions, the kind of pragmatic adjustment that experienced surveyors made routinely. My target for the day was the meander corner on the west boundary of Section 23, which Thornton had established near Howling Creek. According to his notes, he'd placed the monument on the bank of the creek, set back far enough to avoid erosion, but close enough to clearly mark the intersection of the section line with the waterway. The modern topographic maps showed the creek running through a relatively steep-sided ravine, cutting through the volcanic terrain in a path that suggested it followed some ancient fracture in the underlying rock. The hike to the creek took most of the morning. My GPS indicated the distance was approximately 5 miles from camp, but the broken terrain meant I had to frequently detour around obstacles, ravines too steep to safely descend, areas of loose talus that could turn and ankle dense patches of thorny vegetation. The quality of the light remained oddly flat, making it difficult to judge the slope of the ground ahead of me, and twice I found myself unexpectedly at the edge of shallow depressions that hadn't been visible from more than a few meters away. The landscape's tendency to repeat itself became more pronounced as I traveled. I began making detailed notes about distinctive features I passed, specific rock formations, individual plants with unusual growth patterns, areas where the soil color changed abruptly. and within an hour, I documented the same features appearing multiple times in different locations. A juniper tree with a lightning strike scar appeared 3 times, always on my right side, always approximately 100 meters away. An outcrop of columnar basalt with a distinctive hexagonal weathering pattern appeared 5 times, in positions that should have been geometrically impossible given my trajectory. I stopped to verify my GPS coordinates and found that according to the receiver, I was making steady progress toward my destination. The coordinates were changing at exactly the rate they should given my walking speed and bearing. But the landscape around me was clearly not progressing in the same linear fashion. Features were repeating, cycling, appearing in permutations that suggested I was moving through some kind of loop, even as my GPS insisted I was traveling in a straight line. The rational explanation was that I was experiencing some kind of perceptual error, a trick of memory or pattern recognition that made dissimilar features seem identical. The human brain was exceptionally good at finding patterns, even in random data, and it was entirely possible that I was unconsciously selecting features that fit a template and ignoring the subtle differences that would reveal them as distinct objects. The fact that I'd slept poorly and was operating in an environment that was already proving disorienting made this explanation even more plausible. But the explanation didn't quite satisfy me, because the repeated features weren't just similar. They were identical down to very specific details. The lightning strike scar on the juniper had the same spiral pattern each time. The hexagonal columns in the basalt outcrop had the same weathering pattern, the same small variations in width, the same particular arrangement. If I was hallucinating or misremembering, I was doing so with an impossible level of detailed consistency. I continued walking, trying to focus on my GPS coordinates rather than my visual observations, and eventually the terrain began to change in a way that suggested I was actually approaching Howling Creek. The ground started to slope downward more consistently, and the vegetation shifted to species that could tolerate more moisture: willows, wild roses, a few scattered cottonwoods. I could see the edge of the ravine ahead, a sudden break in the ground where the landscape dropped away into shadow. When I reached the rim of the ravine and looked down, I understood why the creek was called Howling Creek, even though I couldn't hear any sound of water. The ravine was deeper and steeper than the topographic maps had suggested, cutting perhaps 60 feet down into layered volcanic rock that formed near vertical walls. The bottom of the ravine should have contained the creek, but from my elevated position, I couldn't see any water. Just a rocky channel scattered with boulders and driftwood that suggested water had once flowed there, perhaps during spring runoff, but wasn't currently present. I worked my way along the rim, looking for a safe place to descend. Thornton's notes indicated he'd placed the meander corner on the west bank, which meant I needed to get down into the ravine, locate the monument, and then figure out how to mark the exact position of the section line where it intersected the dry stream bed. The walls of the ravine were nearly vertical for long stretches, but eventually I found a section where erosion had created something approximating a path, steep and loose, but navigable with care. The descent took longer than I expected. The slope was unstable, and several times I had to backtrack when I encountered cliff faces that I couldn't safely negotiate. The light grew dimmer as I descended, which made sense given the depth of the ravine, but the quality of the dimness was strange. It wasn't the gradual shading you'd expect from moving into a shadow. It was more like the light was being actively drained away, absorbed by the rock walls in a way that left the air itself looking thin and gray. By the time I reached the bottom of the ravine, I was sweating despite the cool air and breathing heavily from the exertion. I set down my pack and took a moment to examine my surroundings. The floor of the ravine was maybe 20 feet wide, composed of smooth, rounded stones that confirmed water had once moved through here with considerable force. Driftwood logs were wedged between boulders, their wood bleached gray by sun and water. Everything was bone dry. If there was any groundwater flowing through this channel, it was deep enough underground that it left no surface expression. I consulted my GPS to determine where along the ravine Thornton's coordinates placed the meander corner, then began walking upstream, scanning the west bank for any sign of the monument. The walls of the ravine rose on both sides, creating a sense of enclosure that my professional training told me was purely psychological, but which felt distinctly claustrophobic anyway. The silence was absolute here, so complete that I could hear the blood moving through my inner ear, a faint rhythmic pulse that provided the only sound in the void. I found the monument after about 20 minutes of searching, another sandstone block with a brass cap, this one set into the bank about 4 feet above the current floor of the ravine. The cap was heavily corroded, worse than the previous monument, but the stamping was still legible. GLO 1889 MCWS23. Meander Corner, West Line, Section 23. The position was wrong again, but this time the error was even larger. According to my GPS, the monument was nearly 600 meters from where Thornton's coordinates indicated it should be. That suggested his entire section line was badly misaligned, which would make finalizing the land exchange extraordinarily complicated. We'd essentially have to decide whether to honor Thornton's physical monuments, which were the legal definition of the boundary, or to retrace his intended survey using modern technology, which would create a new line that might cut through existing improvements or conflict with long-established usage patterns. I was contemplating these administrative headaches and setting up my total station to document the monument's position when I noticed the sound. It took me a moment to recognize it because I'd become so accustomed to the silence. A faint rushing noise, like water moving over stone, coming from somewhere upstream. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it was definitely there, and it was definitely moving toward me. I looked up the ravine and saw water. It appeared suddenly, without warning, a wall of brown liquid about 3 feet high moving rapidly down the channel between the rock walls. There had been no rain, no distant thunder, no warning at all, just an abrupt manifestation of moving water where moments before there had been only dry stone and driftwood. Flash flood. The words appeared in my mind with absolute clarity, along with everything I knew about the lethality of water moving through confined spaces in arid environments. People died every year in floods like this, caught in ravines and washes when distant rainstorms sent water racing down channels faster than any human could run. The fact that I hadn't seen or heard any storm didn't matter. Desert storms could drop enormous amounts of water in very localized areas. And in Badlands terrain like this, every drop of rain was channeled efficiently downhill into the drainage networks. I abandoned my equipment and ran. The wall of water hit the floor of the ravine behind me with a sound like continuous thunder, and suddenly the air was full of spray and the roar of moving liquid slamming into stone. I scrambled toward the nearest point where the ravine wall looked climbable, my boots slipping on the wet rock, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the water rising, could hear the driftwood logs being picked up and slammed against the walls with explosive impacts. I found a crack in the rock face and wedged my fingers into it, pulled myself up, found a foothold, pushed higher. The water reached my legs, cold and powerful, trying to sweep me downstream. I pulled myself higher, found another handhold, another foothold, climbed with the desperate efficiency of someone who understands that falling means dying. The roar of the water filled the ravine, echoing off the walls until it seemed like the stone itself was screaming. I pulled myself over the rim of the ravine and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my hands shaking from adrenaline and exertion. Behind me, I could hear the water continuing to rush through the channel, a sustained roar that went on and on without diminishing. I crawled to the edge and looked down. The ravine was empty, dry stone and driftwood, exactly as it had been before the water appeared. No evidence of any water passage at all. The driftwood logs were in the same positions. The floor of the ravine showed no signs of recent flow, and my equipment, which should have been swept away or buried under sediment, was sitting exactly where I'd left it, completely dry. I stared down at the scene for a long time, trying to reconcile what I just experienced with what I was currently observing. The evidence of my senses said I'd fled from a flash flood. The evidence of my eyes said no flood had occurred. These two facts could not both be true, but I just experienced them in immediate succession, and I had no framework for understanding how to resolve the contradiction. Eventually, I climbed back down into the ravine. My legs were shaking, partly from the exertion of climbing and partly from something that felt like shock, even though nothing had actually happened. I checked my equipment, all functional, completely dry. I checked my boots and clothing, also dry, showing no evidence of having been in water. I checked my hands, which still felt wet from the spray, and found them completely dry, the skin showing no signs of moisture at all. I documented the monument's position with methodical, deliberate care, forcing myself through the familiar routine of survey work as a way of reasserting control over a situation that felt increasingly untethered from rational explanation. I took photographs, recorded GPS coordinates, measured angles to reference points, and filled out my field notes with precise, technical language that made no mention of water or floods or impossible experiences. By the time I finished, the sun was dropping toward the western horizon again, and I knew I needed to start the hike back to camp. But I found myself reluctant to leave the ravine, even though staying here as darkness fell was objectively more dangerous than traveling back across open terrain. The ravine felt like a known quantity now, despite, or perhaps because of, what I'd experienced here. The open landscape above felt less predictable, more prone to unexpected transformations. I forced myself to climb out anyway, to shoulder my pack and consult my GPS and begin walking back toward camp. The journey took longer than it should have again. The landscape repeated itself again. My compass pointed in yet another impossible direction, suggesting some property of space here that shifted constantly, but always resolved to specific wrong values rather than the continuous variation you'd expect from genuine measurement error. I reached camp well after dark, guided by my GPS and a small headlamp that seemed to create more shadows than it dispelled. I heated food, reviewed my notes, and tried to decide whether to call my supervisor and request early extraction. I had grounds for it. The magnetic anomalies alone justified aborting the survey until we could bring in specialized equipment to map the phenomenon. Add the perceptual distortions and the impossible flood, and I had more than enough reason to declare the conditions unsuitable for safe survey work. But I didn't make the call. partly because I knew how it would sound. A senior cartographer with 12 years of experience calling for extraction after just 2 days because his compass was acting strangely, and he'd experienced what was probably a very realistic stress dream while working near a dry stream bed. Partly because I had professional pride and didn't want to be the person who couldn't complete a routine boundary survey. And partly because I was increasingly convinced that what was happening here was genuinely unprecedented, something that needed to be documented rather than avoided. So I decided to continue the survey. I'd locate the final monument, the witness tree marker near the confluence, and complete my field work, and then I could make a decision about early extraction based on whether the phenomena continued or resolved themselves. That's what I told myself as I fell asleep for the second night. I was making a rational decision to complete my professional obligations despite challenging conditions. The truth, which I couldn't quite admit yet, was that something about this place had hooked itself into my mind, and I needed to understand it the way a puzzle demands to be solved. The discrepancies, the repetition, the impossible flood, the failing compass, they weren't just obstacles to my work. They were a pattern, and patterns could be mapped, and if something could be mapped, I could understand it. I just needed more data. The third day started with an observation that should have sent me back to camp immediately. When I checked my GPS receiver that morning, I found that according to the satellite coordinates, my camp had moved. Not the receiver's position within the camp. The camp itself had shifted approximately 200 meters northwest of where I'd established it 2 days earlier. The coordinates for my tent, my equipment cases, my camp stove, all of them showed values that were distinctly different from what I'd recorded in my initial site documentation. I verified the receiver's function by going through the standard diagnostic procedures. The device was tracking signals from 11 satellites, which was more than enough for reliable positioning. The dilution of precision values were well within acceptable ranges. The battery was fully charged. Every technical indicator suggested the GPS was functioning correctly. It was reporting coordinates that were roughly 200 meters northwest of where I'd established camp, which meant either my camp had moved during the night, or the satellite constellation had collectively agreed to report incorrect positions, or the fundamental geometric relationship between my position and the orbiting satellites had somehow shifted. None of these explanations were possible, which meant my earlier conviction that I was experiencing some kind of localized magnetic anomaly was insufficient to explain what was happening. Magnetic anomalies affected compass readings, but GPS positioning was based on timing signals from satellites and required no knowledge of magnetic fields at all. If my GPS coordinates were wrong, it wasn't because of magnetism. It was because either the satellites had moved, or I had moved, or space itself had reorganized in a way that changed the distance between myself and the orbiting transmitters. I stood outside my tent for a long time that morning, holding the GPS receiver and watching the coordinates update every second with values that were absolutely consistent, perfectly stable, and demonstrably impossible. If this had been my first day on site, I might have convinced myself that I'd made an error in my initial documentation, that I'd recorded the wrong coordinates through carelessness or fatigue. But I'd been doing this work for 12 years, and I knew my own level of precision. I hadn't made a recording error. The coordinates had changed, which meant the landscape had moved, or I had moved with it, or something had altered the geometric relationship between surface features, in a way that GPS satellites dutifully reported as coordinate changes, even though the physical objects themselves remained in constant relative positions. I should have called for extraction right then. This was beyond magnetic anomalies or perceptual distortions. This was fundamental geodetic instability, which wasn't supposed to exist outside of earthquake zones, and even then only as gradual crustal deformation measured over years, not sudden 200-meter jumps overnight. If I reported this accurately, and I was obligated to report it accurately, it would trigger a chain of investigations involving specialists in geodesy, seismology, and probably geology. The Bureau of Land Management would have to halt the land exchange indefinitely. The regional office would demand answers I couldn't provide. And beneath all these practical concerns was something more fundamental, a growing suspicion that calling for extraction wouldn't help, because whatever was happening here might not be bound by the kind of geographical constraints that would allow me to simply leave it behind. The landscape was reorganizing itself around me. If space itself was unstable, what guarantee did I have that moving to a different set of coordinates would actually move me to a different place? This reasoning was paranoid, untethered from rational analysis. But paranoia implied an irrational fear, and I was increasingly uncertain whether what I was experiencing was irrational at all. Something was happening here that my training hadn't prepared me for, and the scientific method demanded that I gather more data before drawing conclusions. So I made another decision that I would later recognize as a mistake. I continued the survey. My destination was the witness tree marker, which according to Thornton's notes was located near the confluence of Howling Creek and an unnamed tributary. The witness tree concept dated back to the earliest days of American cadastral surveying, when establishing permanent monuments was difficult or impossible. Surveyors would mark a nearby tree with carved symbols and use it as a reference point that could be relocated by future surveyors. Thornton had described the witness tree as a juniper of substantial girth, bearing the mark Vol.23 carved at breast height, located 3 chains north of the confluence. 3 chains was roughly 200 feet in modern units, which meant the tree should be relatively easy to locate once I found the confluence. The challenge was that the unnamed tributary wasn't shown on modern topographic maps, which suggested it was either a seasonal drainage that only carried water during spring snowmelt, or it had been misidentified by Thornton and didn't actually exist as a distinct water course. The hike to the confluence area took most of the morning, and by now I'd stopped being surprised when the landscape repeated itself. The same formations appeared and reappeared in an irregular cycle that I was beginning to recognize as having a kind of rhythm, though not one based on distance traveled. Instead, the repetition seemed keyed to something more abstract. My attention, perhaps, or my emotional state, or some other property that I couldn't identify but which the environment was responding to in ways that created patterns in my perception. I'd also started to notice that my compass was no longer simply pointing in wrong directions. It was pointing towards something. Each morning when I checked it, the needle oriented toward a bearing that changed daily, but which always seemed to suggest a specific location rather than a cardinal direction. The first day, it had pointed 90 degrees off from true north. The second day, 180 degrees. Today, it was pointing almost due north, which meant it was finally indicating a bearing that was close to correct. except that the deflection pattern suggested it would continue rotating through the remaining 90 degrees by tomorrow morning. 4 days, 4 90-degree rotations. A full 360-degree cycle completed over the course of my scheduled field time. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental, which meant the magnetic anomaly, or whatever was causing the compass deflection, was operating on a schedule that corresponded to my presence here. It was responding to me, or to the survey itself, in ways that implied something approximating intelligence or at least purposeful behavior. I reached the area where Howling Creek should have had its confluence with the unnamed tributary around midday. The terrain here was more broken than the previous areas I'd surveyed, cut by multiple shallow ravines that suggested water once flowed here in more abundance. The main channel of Howling Creek was visible as a deeper cut, running roughly northwest to southeast, but I could see several smaller drainages intersecting it at various angles. Without more detailed information from Thornton's notes, I had no way of knowing which of these was the tributary he'd mentioned. I decided to search each drainage systematically, looking for any juniper tree of unusual size that might have survived from 1889. Junipers were long-lived trees. Specimens in this region could easily be several hundred years old, and if Thornton had selected a particularly large one as his witness tree, it might still be alive today, assuming it hadn't been destroyed by fire or lightning or drought. The search took hours. I worked my way along each drainage, scanning for large junipers and checking any promising specimens for carved marks that might have survived over a century of weathering. The sun moved across the sky in its normal arc, and the shadows shifted in normal ways, and for a stretch of time, the landscape behaved exactly as landscapes were supposed to behave: static, predictable, indifferent to observation. I found the witness tree in late afternoon, not near the confluence where Thornton's coordinates suggested it should be, but rather on the south rim of a small drainage about 800 meters away. It was indeed a juniper of substantial girth, easily 3 feet in diameter, with twisted branches and shaggy bark that suggested great age. And carved into the trunk at roughly breast height, still visible despite weathering and bark growth, were the letters Vol.23. I stood in front of the tree for a long moment, running my fingers over the carved letters and trying to understand what Thornton's error in positioning could mean. 800 meters was an extraordinary discrepancy for a surveyor of his evident skill. The compass problems might explain some degree of error in his angle measurements, but not errors of this magnitude, and not errors that were consistent in direction across all 3 monuments I'd located. It was as if he'd surveyed the entire section using one set of coordinates. Then someone had picked up all his monuments and moved them hundreds of meters in a consistent direction, creating a translated version of his survey that preserved all the relative distances, but existed in the wrong absolute location. Except monuments didn't move. They were called permanent for a reason. They were set in concrete or buried deep enough to resist frost heave and erosion. The sandstone blocks I'd found were heavy, 30 or 40 pounds each, and had no reason to migrate across the landscape even over the course of a century. I was setting up my total station to document the tree's position when I noticed the carving on the opposite side of the trunk. More letters, these ones less formally carved, cut more deeply into the wood in handwriting that I recognized from having spent hours studying Thornton's field notes. The bearing wanders, 3 times established, 3 times moved by morning. Local Indians say this land refuses ownership. I begin to understand their meaning. May God forgive me if I have laid claim to something that was never mine to mark. E.T. Sept. 23, 1889. I photographed the inscription from multiple angles, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. This was no longer just a surveying discrepancy or an isolated magnetic anomaly. Thornton had experienced the same phenomena I was encountering: the impossible movement of established positions, the landscape's refusal to remain mapped. He'd recognized it as something beyond normal surveying challenges, and had apparently tried multiple times to establish this monument before giving up and recording coordinates that he must have known were compromised. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and I needed to return to camp before dark, but I found myself unable to leave the tree. Thornton's inscription felt like a message directed specifically at me, a warning transmitted across nearly 140 years from one cartographer to another. He tried to map this place. He'd recognized that it resisted mapping, and he'd apparently completed the survey anyway, creating documents that would enter the official record despite knowing they were fundamentally inaccurate. Why? The obvious answer was professional obligation. He'd been hired to complete the survey, and leaving it unfinished would have professional and financial consequences. But the inscription suggested something more than pragmatic compromise. May God forgive me if I have laid claim to something that was never mine to mark. That was the language of moral transgression, not mere cartographic error. I finished documenting the tree's position as the light failed, working by headlamp in the growing darkness. The work was mechanical, routine, requiring no conscious thought after years of practice. My hands positioned instruments and recorded readings while my mind worked on Thornton's words, turning them over like stones to examine what lay beneath. The phrase "something that was never mine to mark" implied ownership. Not legal ownership, but something more fundamental. Cartography was an act of claiming, of asserting human comprehension and control over territory. When we mapped a place, we transformed it from unknown space into documented property. We gave it coordinates, assigned it to a grid, made it part of a larger system of measurement and control. Thornton seemed to be suggesting that this particular landscape resisted that transformation, that it had some quality that made it unsuitable for cartographic appropriation. Or perhaps not unsuitable, perhaps dangerous. May God forgive me suggested consequences, moral or otherwise, for the act of mapping, as if by documenting this place, by creating official records of its position and characteristics, Thornton had done something that would require divine forgiveness. I packed my equipment as these thoughts circled through my mind, then began the walk back to camp. The darkness was absolute now, the thin crescent moon not yet risen, and my headlamp created a small bubble of illumination that made the surrounding darkness feel even more complete by contrast. I walked by GPS bearing, watching the coordinates count down toward my camp's position, though I had no particular confidence that the camp would actually be where the GPS said it should be. The landscape repeated itself even in darkness. I'd pass a rock formation that appeared as a particular arrangement of shadows in my headlamp beam, continue walking for 20 minutes, then encounter the same formation in the same position relative to my path. The repetition was so consistent that I started using it as a navigation check. When I saw the familiar formation, I knew I'd covered another segment of the journey, even though the GPS insisted I'd traveled in a straight line without circling back. I was perhaps halfway back to camp when my headlamp illuminated something that didn't fit the pattern: a cairn. a deliberately stacked pile of rocks sitting directly in my path. It hadn't been there when I'd walked this route earlier in the day. I would have noticed and documented it as a potential survey marker. But here it was, unmistakable and impossible to ignore, roughly 3 feet high, and composed of flat stones stacked with obvious intention. I approached cautiously, irrationally worried about disturbing something I didn't understand. Cairns were common in wilderness areas, used as trail markers or memorial sites, but I was miles from any established trail, and the landscape here didn't see enough traffic to justify trail marking. This cairn had been built specifically, placed deliberately in what should have been an empty stretch of volcanic badlands. I circled it slowly, examining the structure by headlamp. The stones were local basalt, flat fragments that stacked naturally. The construction was competent but not elaborate, just a simple pile designed to be visible and permanent. No inscriptions, no objects placed on or near it, no indication of its purpose. When I completed my circuit and returned to my original position, I found a second cairn, identical to the first, now sitting approximately 20 feet away from the first one, along my line of travel toward camp. I stood very still and swept my headlamp beam in a complete circle. My light illuminated a third cairn, then a fourth, then more, a line of them extending in both directions, marking a path that corresponded exactly to my intended route back to camp. They hadn't been there a moment ago. I was certain of this with the kind of absolute conviction that transcends rational doubt. I'd circled the first cairn with my headlamp beam, had seen the empty landscape around it, and now that landscape contained multiple cairns that formed a deliberate path. They'd appeared while I was examining the first one, or they'd always been there and only became visible under certain conditions, or the landscape had reorganized itself to include them, or I was experiencing some kind of breakdown in my ability to process sensory information accurately. I should have been terrified. The rational response to objects appearing spontaneously in your path should be fear, or at least profound unease. But what I actually felt was something closer to recognition, as if some part of my mind had been expecting this development and was almost relieved that it had finally occurred. The landscape was communicating with me, offering guidance, marking a path that it wanted me to follow. Or it was creating a path to lead me somewhere I wouldn't otherwise go. I stood at the first cairn for a long time, weighing my options. I could continue toward camp following my GPS bearing, ignoring the cairns entirely. I could wait here until dawn, hoping that daylight would clarify the situation. Or I could follow the cairn path and see where it led, accepting that I was no longer in control of this survey, and that something about this place was actively directing my movement through it. The GPS showed camp as 2.3 miles ahead, bearing approximately 180 degrees. The cairn path led in a direction that my compass, still pointing in an impossible direction, suggested was north, though I had no faith that this meant magnetic north or any kind of north that corresponded to conventional cardinal directions. I followed the cairns. The decision felt both foolish and inevitable. Every principle of wilderness safety I'd ever learned said to maintain your planned route, to trust your navigation instruments, to resist the impulse to deviate based on unclear information. But those principles assumed a landscape that behaved consistently, that obeyed the normal laws governing the relationship between objects and space. I was operating in terrain where monuments moved overnight, where GPS coordinates shifted, where compass readings rotated on a 4-day cycle. The normal rules didn't apply, which meant I needed to develop new rules. And the only way to develop new rules was to gather more data by exploring what the landscape itself seemed to be offering. The cairn path led me through terrain I didn't recognize, even though according to my GPS, I was still traveling through the area I'd surveyed over the previous days. The volcanic formations were different, taller, more dramatically fractured, creating narrow passages between walls of dark stone. The vegetation was sparser, replaced by patches of bare soil that showed no sign of recent disturbance but which somehow felt wrong, as if the emptiness was too complete, too carefully maintained. I walked for what felt like hours, though when I checked my GPS, only 30 minutes had passed. The cairns appeared at regular intervals, always just visible at the edge of my headlamp beam, guiding me onward through increasingly confined spaces. The temperature dropped steadily, and the air developed a quality that reminded me of the interior of caves, cool, still, and somehow pressurized, as if the atmosphere itself was thicker here. Eventually, the cairn path led me to the edge of another ravine, this one smaller and steeper than Howling Creek's channel. My headlamp beam couldn't reach the bottom, which meant it was deep, 40 feet at least, perhaps more. The cairns led down into it via a narrow path cut into the rock face, steep but navigable, exactly the kind of route an experienced hiker might use to access the bottom of a canyon. I stood at the edge and tried to decide if following the path down into an unknown ravine in complete darkness represented a reasonable action for a person hoping to survive the next few hours. By any objective standard, it didn't. Entering confined spaces in darkness was dangerous. Descending uncertain terrain without backup communication or companionship was dangerous. Following a path marked by mysteriously appearing cairns into a landscape that had already demonstrated its willingness to violate normal physical principles was extremely dangerous. But I was already committed to understanding this place, and turning back now would only mean returning to a camp whose coordinates had already shifted once and might shift again, leaving me stranded in darkness without shelter or supplies. At least the cairn path was offering a direction, a sense of purposeful movement towards something, even if I didn't know what that something was. I started down. The descent was longer and more difficult than I'd expected. The path was barely wide enough for my boots, and the rock face beside me was smooth enough that there were few good handholds. I had to proceed slowly, testing each step before committing my weight, aware that a fall from this height onto the rocky floor below would likely be fatal. My headlamp beam bounced as I moved, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the shadows jump and shift in ways that suggested movement where there was none. Halfway down, I realized I could hear water, not the rushing torrent I'd experienced or hallucinated in Howling Creek, but something gentler, a steady trickling sound that echoed off the ravine walls. The sound grew louder as I descended, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see the source, a small spring emerging from a crack in the rock wall, feeding a pool of clear water that reflected my headlamp beam like polished obsidian. The pool was perhaps 10 feet across, rimmed with smooth stones that had been arranged deliberately into a circular border. More cairns surrounded it at regular intervals, forming a perimeter that clearly marked this as a significant location. And beside the pool, carved into the rock face in letters that were deep enough to have survived decades of weathering, was a message. To whoever follows, turn back. This is the center of the wrongness, the point from which all deviation begins. I established my monuments here in ignorance and have condemned others to experience what I have experienced. The land requires nothing from us but absence. E. Thornton, Oct. 4, 1889. October 4th. Thornton had returned here more than a week after completing his initial survey, had somehow found this location even though his field notes made no mention of it, and had left a warning that suggested he understood far more about this place than he'd been willing to document in his official records. I photographed the inscription, then turned my attention to the pool. The water was extraordinarily clear enough that I could see straight to the bottom, even though my depth perception suggested it was at least 8 feet deep. The bottom was covered with smooth stones, and arranged among them in a pattern that looked deliberate were objects that shouldn't have been there. A surveyor's compass in a brass housing, badly corroded but still recognizable. A steel measuring chain, coiled neatly. A field notebook in a leather cover that had somehow remained intact despite being underwater. Thornton's equipment. He'd left it here deliberately, submerged in this spring as if making an offering or attempting to undo his survey by returning the tools to the land he'd mapped. I knelt beside the pool and stared down at the submerged objects, trying to understand what Thornton had intended. The compass was clearly visible, the needle frozen in some orientation I couldn't determine from this angle. The field notebook was closed, its leather cover dark with water but showing no signs of deterioration. If I could retrieve it, read Thornton's unedited notes from his time here, I might finally understand what he'd experienced and how he'd interpreted it. The water was cold when I reached into the pool, cold enough to make my hand ache immediately. I stretched down, trying to reach the notebook, and found that the pool was deeper than it looked. My arm was submerged to the shoulder and I still couldn't touch the bottom. I leaned further, bracing myself against the stone rim, extending my reach as far as possible. My fingers brushed the leather cover, and in that moment of contact, I felt the pool react. The water surged upward, not violently but with a kind of purposeful rising, as if something at the bottom had decided to meet me halfway. My hand closed around the notebook, and then I was pulling it up through water that felt suddenly thick, resistant, almost viscous. The notebook broke the surface with a sound like tearing fabric, and water poured from its edges in amounts that shouldn't have fit inside such a small object. I pulled the notebook free and fell backward onto the stone, my hand still clutching the leather cover. Water continued to pour from the book for several seconds, far more water than its volume could have contained, before finally stopping with an abruptness that suggested the flow had been deliberately terminated rather than naturally exhausted. I sat on the cold stone, breathing heavily, staring at the notebook in my hand. It should have been destroyed by immersion. The paper pulped, the ink dissolved, everything reduced to an illegible mass. But when I opened the cover with shaking fingers, I found the pages were dry, the ink perfectly preserved, Thornton's neat handwriting as legible as if he'd written it yesterday. I read by headlamp, turning pages with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The notebook was Thornton's personal record, separate from his official field notes, and it documented his growing understanding that something about the Howling Creek area was fundamentally wrong. August 28, 1889 began survey of Township 6 South, Range 41 East. The land here resists measurement. Compass readings vary by position and time of day. Davies reports seeing our camp from the south when we left it to the north this morning. I attribute this to the distorting effects of heat and light in desert country. September 3, we established the section corners for Section 23 today. By evening, they had moved. Not been moved, there are no tracks, no signs of disturbance. They simply occupy different positions than where we placed them. Davies wants to leave. I have insisted we continue. September 12, found the spring today. The water is unlike any I have seen, clear beyond clear, as if it contains no impurities whatsoever. Davies tried to drink from it and became violently ill. Says he saw things in the water, images of places we have been and places we have not been yet. I begin to think we have found something that was meant to remain unfound. September 18. The survey is complete in the sense that I have established all required monuments and recorded all necessary observations. But the coordinates are meaningless. The land shifts position relative to itself, creating a geography that cannot be represented on a flat map. I have done my best to create documents that will satisfy the requirements of the General Land Office, but I know they are lies. We are marking ownership of something that cannot be owned, creating boundaries where no boundaries can exist. September 23, Davies has left, taking one of the horses and half the supplies. Cannot blame him. I myself would leave if I had not become convinced that we have done something requiring remedy. By imposing coordinates on this place, we have injured it in some way. The land was complete before we arrived, existing in whatever state suited its nature. Now it struggles to maintain both its true form and the form we have tried to impose on it. I can feel the strain of this contradiction in the air itself. October 4, I have returned to the spring and left my instruments here. Perhaps this will satisfy whatever intelligence governs this place. Perhaps not. I can do nothing more except warn others to avoid what I have done. The Indians call this area the shifting ground, and they were right to refuse our request for guides. May God forgive my arrogance in believing that measurement equaled understanding. The notebook continued for several more pages, but the entries became less coherent, fragmenting into repeated phrases and observations that suggested Thornton had been experiencing some kind of psychological deterioration. The final entry was dated October 10, 1889, and consisted of a single sentence. The survey is never finished because the land is never still. I closed the notebook and sat in the darkness beside the pool, trying to process what I'd read. Thornton had recognized that the landscape here operated according to principles that made conventional surveying impossible. He'd completed his survey anyway, creating documents that entered the official record despite knowing they were inaccurate. And he'd returned here to leave his instruments as some kind of offering or apology to the land he tried to map. 136 years later, I was in exactly the same position. I'd located Thornton's monuments, documented their positions, and accumulated evidence that the entire survey was compromised by phenomena that I couldn't explain. I could complete my work as Thornton had done, creating documents that would allow the land exchange to proceed despite knowing the boundaries were essentially fictional. Or I could refuse to certify the survey, citing the geodetic instability and recommending that the area be excluded from any future land exchanges or development. The responsible choice was obvious. I should refuse certification, file a detailed report about the anomalies, and recommend further investigation by specialists. That was what my training demanded, what my professional ethics required, what my obligation to accurate documentation compelled. But I was increasingly convinced that further investigation would simply lead to more people experiencing what Thornton and I had experienced. The destabilizing recognition that some places resisted the kind of systematic comprehension that mapping represented. And I couldn't shake Thornton's phrase, "We have injured it in some way." If mapping this place caused harm to whatever intelligence or system governed its behavior, then recommending more mapping seemed like the worst possible response. I was still sitting beside the pool, turning these thoughts over in my mind, when I noticed that my headlamp was dimming. The battery had been fully charged when I left camp, but the beam was now a pale yellow color that suggested imminent failure. I checked my watch and was startled to discover that it was nearly 2 in the morning. I'd been reading Thornton's notebook for more than 4 hours, though it had felt like 20 minutes at most. The battery died completely as I was trying to retrieve my backup flashlight from my pack. The darkness that followed was absolute, so complete that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I stood motionless, fighting down a surge of panic, reminding myself that I had backup light sources, that the situation was manageable, that darkness was just the absence of light and posed no direct threat. My hands found the flashlight in my pack and activated it. The beam was steady and bright, and I swept it around the ravine floor to reorient myself. The pool was still there, the cairns still in their positions, everything exactly as it had been. But when my light illuminated the rock face where Thornton's inscription had been carved, I found new text beneath the old message, carved in the same deep letters but visibly fresher, the stone showing lighter color where it had been recently cut. David Reamer, do not finish. September 2026. I read the words 3 times, my mind refusing to process their implications. Someone had carved my name and a date that was 11 months in my future. Either this inscription had been waiting here for months before my arrival, which implied impossible foreknowledge, or it had appeared recently, which implied equally impossible causal mechanics. Or I was looking at something that had always been here, carved by Thornton alongside his other message, and my mind was interpreting it as my name and a future date, because I was experiencing some kind of psychological break brought on by exhaustion and stress, and several days of accumulating perceptual anomalies. Except the stone around the new carving was visibly lighter, showing the characteristic color of recently fractured basalt. This inscription was fresh, days old at most, possibly carved while I was in the ravine reading Thornton's notebook, possibly carved through some means that didn't require physical presence at all. I backed away from the wall, my flashlight beam jumping erratically as my hand shook. The rational part of my mind was screaming that I needed to leave immediately, to climb out of this ravine and call for extraction, and never return to this area. The rest of my mind was fascinated, compelled, convinced that I was experiencing something unprecedented that demanded further investigation regardless of personal risk. The cairn path led out of the ravine via a different route than I'd used to descend, a gentler slope that eventually brought me to the rim on the opposite side. I followed it mechanically, no longer trusting my own navigation, accepting that something about this place was directing my movement, and that resistance would be futile. The cairns led me through more broken terrain, past formations I didn't recognize, under a sky that should have shown stars, but instead displayed a flat gray emptiness like heavy overcast. When the cairn path finally ended, I found myself standing at my camp. Not near my camp, not within sight of it, standing directly beside my tent, as if I'd walked in a circle and returned to my starting point, even though my GPS showed I'd traveled more than 6 miles in a nearly straight line away from this location. I crawled into my tent without bothering to remove my boots or unpack my equipment. I was asleep within minutes, my exhaustion overriding every instinct that said I should stay awake and vigilant in an environment that had proven itself unpredictable and potentially hostile. I woke to daylight and the sound of helicopter rotors. The sound was impossible. I wasn't scheduled for extraction for another 10 days, and there was no reason for the helicopter to return early unless my supervisor had become concerned about missed check-ins. But I hadn't missed any check-ins. I'd been calling in my coordinates every evening as required, confirming that I was on schedule and experiencing no difficulties. I crawled out of my tent and saw Rodriguez's helicopter settling onto the flat area where he'd originally dropped me off. The pilot was visible through the canopy, gesturing urgently for me to approach. I grabbed my pack and stumbled toward the aircraft, assuming there must be some emergency that required immediate evacuation. A weather system moving in, a change in land ownership that made my presence here illegal, some administrative crisis that I'd been too isolated to learn about. Rodriguez killed the engine as I approached, and I could see his expression through the open door. Concern, confusion, and something that looked like relief. He climbed out and stood facing me, hands on his hips, studying me with an intensity that seemed excessive given the situation. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice rough. 3 days, I said, confused by the question. "Why, what's wrong?" 3 days. He repeated the words slowly as if testing them for accuracy. "David, I dropped you off here 12 days ago. You've missed 6 check-ins. We've had search and rescue teams looking for you since day 8. What the hell happened?" I stared at him, trying to process this information. 12 days. But I'd only been on site for 3 days. I was certain of this, could account for every hour, had detailed notes documenting my activities. My watch showed the correct date, September 24th, 3 days after my arrival on September 21st. Except Rodriguez was holding his own watch now, tilting it so I could see the display. October 2nd. More than 10 days after I thought it was, exactly matching the time frame he claimed. "That's wrong," I said, hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. "The date, it's the 24th. "David, it's October 2nd. You've been missing for 4 days. We thought you were dead." "Missing?" I pulled out my satellite phone, powered it on, and checked the internal clock. October 2nd. I scrolled through the call log and found entries I didn't remember making. Check-in calls on September 25th, 27th, 29th, October 1st. All showing as completed calls, all dated from days I had no memory of experiencing. "I called in," I said weakly, holding up the phone. "Look, the call log, I called in." Rodriguez took the phone from my hand and examined it, his expression growing more concerned. "These calls lasted less than 10 seconds each. You said wrong number and hung up. We figured your phone was malfunctioning, that you were trying to reach us but couldn't maintain connection." I had no memory of making those calls. No memory of the days between September 24th and October 2nd. 8 days of missing time, documented only by call logs and Rodriguez's insistence that I'd been here far longer than I remembered. "We need to leave," Rodriguez said, already moving back toward the helicopter. "Grab whatever gear is critical. We'll come back for the rest later if necessary." "I need to get my field notes," I said. "The survey data, I can't leave that." "Fine, 5 minutes. Get your notes and get in the aircraft." I ran back to my tent, my mind racing through implications. 8 days of missing time meant I'd been doing something during that period, moving through the landscape, perhaps even completing more survey work, but I had no conscious memory of it. Either I'd experienced some kind of fugue state, or the temporal anomalies I'd already documented had extended beyond simple GPS coordinate shifts into actual time distortion. Or I was having a psychotic break, and none of what I was experiencing was reliable. I grabbed my field notebook and equipment cases, did a quick scan of the tent for anything critical, and noticed something that made me stop. On the ground beside my sleeping bag was a stack of papers, survey plats, freshly drawn, showing the complete boundary survey of the entire township. Every section corner documented, every bearing recorded, every distance measured. The plats were in my handwriting, filled with technical details and certified coordinates, signed and dated October 1st. I'd completed the survey, or something that looked like me had completed it. During the 8 days I couldn't remember, producing documents that were technically perfect and procedurally correct. I gathered the papers with shaking hands and stuffed them into my pack along with Thornton's notebook, which I'd apparently brought back from the spring without remembering doing so. Then I ran back to the helicopter and climbed in, and Rodriguez lifted us away from the landscape that had consumed more than a week of my life without my awareness or consent. The flight back to civilization took 90 minutes, and Rodriguez didn't ask me any questions during that time, though I could see him glancing over at me periodically with an expression that suggested he was trying to decide if I needed immediate medical attention. I spent the flight reviewing the survey plats I'd apparently created, and they were flawless, every measurement precise, every calculation correct, every detail documented with the kind of meticulous attention that characterized my best work. Except the coordinates were wrong. Not wildly wrong like Thornton's original survey, but subtly shifted, creating boundaries that were offset from where they should have been by amounts that varied from 50 to 200 meters. Someone using these plats to establish physical boundaries would end up marking lines that didn't quite match the legal descriptions, creating the exact kind of ambiguity and conflict that boundary surveys were supposed to resolve. I'd created documents that would perpetuate the problem rather than solving it. That would ensure future surveyors would have to return to this area and attempt to reconcile multiple contradictory records. I'd done exactly what Thornton had done, completed a technically competent survey that was fundamentally compromised by conditions that made accurate surveying impossible. And I'd done it without remembering, during 8 days of missing time when something else had apparently been operating my body, and using my skills to create documents that would extend the wrongness of this place forward into future generations. Rodriguez dropped me at a small regional airport, where my supervisor Margaret Castellanos was waiting with a vehicle, and an expression of profound relief that shifted quickly into professional concern when she got a closer look at me. I could imagine what she was seeing. A senior cartographer who'd been in the field for 12 days, the last 4 without communication, now haggard and disoriented, and carrying survey documents he couldn't remember creating. "David, what happened out there?" she asked as we drove toward the nearest town with medical facilities. "We were about to declare you a presumed fatality." "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "There were anomalies, geodetic instability, temporal distortions. I lost track of time." She glanced at me sidelong. "You're not making sense." "I know." I pulled out the survey plats and handed them to her. "But I completed the survey. These are the certified documents." She studied them while driving, dividing her attention between the road and the technical details. "These look professional. When did you finish the field work?" "I don't know. Apparently October 1st. But I don't remember anything after September 23rd. She was quiet for a long moment, You're saying you have 8 days of missing time. Yes, and during those 8 days, you completed a complex boundary survey, drafted detailed plats, and certified the results. That's what the documents suggest. But you have no memory of doing this work. None. She drove in silence for another mile, then pulled the vehicle over to the side of the road and turned to face me fully. David, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did something happen out there? An accident? Environmental exposure? Did you hit your head? Nothing like that, I said. Or at least nothing I remember. The landscape was wrong. The GPS coordinates kept shifting. Compass readings were impossible. I found evidence that the original surveyor in 1889 experienced the same phenomena. Elias Thornton, she said, nodding. I read his field notes when I assigned you the project. He documented some compass irregularities, attributed them to local magnetic anomalies. It was more than that. I pulled out Thornton's personal notebook and handed it to her. I found this at a spring in the survey area. He knew the survey was compromised. He tried to warn future surveyors to stay away. Margaret opened the notebook and began reading, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something that looked like alarm. She read for several minutes, flipping through pages, then closed the book and handed it back to me. Where exactly did you find this? In a pool at the bottom of a ravine, submerged in water but somehow perfectly preserved. A book that's been underwater for more than a century, and the ink is still readable. Yes. David, that's not possible. I know. She sat back in her seat, hands still gripping the steering wheel even though the vehicle was parked, staring out at the empty highway ahead of us. You understand what I'm required to do here. If you're reporting temporal distortions, impossible preservation of documents, missing time, I have to refer you for medical evaluation. This could be anything from carbon monoxide exposure to a neurological event. I know, I said again, but before you do that, I need you to look at something else. I pulled out my GPS receiver and showed her the track log, the automatically recorded path that documented everywhere I'd traveled during the survey. The log should have shown a relatively simple pattern, straight lines between my camp and the various monument locations, with some minor deviations for terrain obstacles. Instead, it showed a chaotic tangle of paths that looped and crossed and doubled back on themselves, creating a pattern that looked less like navigation and more like something decorative or symbolic. This is 12 days of movement, I said, but I only remember 3 days, and look at the pattern. She studied the GPS track, zooming in and out on the receiver's display, tracing the lines with her finger. It looks almost like, is that writing? I'd noticed it too during the helicopter ride. When viewed at the correct scale, the GPS track formed letters, rough, irregular, but unmistakable once you recognize them. Boundary fails. The landscape made me write this, I said, hearing how insane the words sounded even as I spoke them. Or something in that area used me to write it, walking me through specific paths over 8 days to create this message in GPS coordinates. Margaret continued staring at the display for a long moment, then handed the receiver back to me and restarted the vehicle. We're going to the hospital. They'll do a full neurological workup, check for environmental toxins, rule out any organic causes for what you're experiencing. And then, depending on what they find, we'll decide how to handle the survey documents. The documents are accurate, I said. Technically perfect. Every measurement is correct, every calculation is verified. They're just wrong. Wrong how? Wrong in their fundamental premise. They assume the landscape is stable enough to be mapped. But it isn't. Thornton knew this. I know it now. And anyone who tries to use those plats to establish physical boundaries is going to encounter the same problems we did. So what are you recommending? That we halt the land exchange. That we tell the Bureau of Land Management and the ranching corporation that a 4,700-acre parcel can't be surveyed because the landscape is unstable. Yes. She was quiet for the rest of the drive. The hospital tests found nothing. No signs of head trauma, no evidence of environmental toxin exposure, no indicators of neurological disease. My blood work was normal. My cognitive function tests were normal. My brain scan showed no abnormalities. According to every objective medical measure, I was a healthy 43-year-old man who'd spent 12 days in the field and was experiencing stress-related disorientation. The attending physician recommended rest and follow-up with a therapist to address what he termed acute stress reaction with dissociative features. He prescribed sleep medication and cleared me to return to work after a week of mandatory leave. Margaret accepted his assessment with visible relief and drove me to a hotel where I spent the next 3 days sleeping 14 hours a day and reviewing my survey documents during the brief periods when I was awake. The documents were perfect. I kept finding new layers of technical detail that demonstrated not just competence but exceptional skill, the kind of work that represented the absolute peak of my professional abilities. Whoever or whatever had operated my body during those missing 8 days had done so with full access to my training and expertise, producing results that I would have been proud to certify under normal circumstances. But the coordinates were wrong, and the wrongness was systematic rather than random. When I plotted all the monument positions on a single map, I could see that they formed a pattern. Not a legal section grid, but something else, a geometric arrangement that seemed to prioritize angles and proportions that had nothing to do with cadastral surveying. The monuments were positioned at locations that created specific geometric relationships between points, as if the landscape had used my survey to establish its own coordinate system, overlaid on top of the legal grid. On my 4th day of leave, I received a call from Margaret. The Bureau of Land Management wants to proceed with the land exchange using your survey. They've reviewed the documents and found them acceptable. The ranching corporation has also signed off. Everything looks good for completion. Don't let them do that, I said immediately. Those coordinates are compromised. Anyone who tries to use them is going to experience the same problems I did. David, I've read your report. I've reviewed your documentation. And I've consulted with 3 other senior cartographers about your findings. The consensus is that you experienced challenging field conditions, significant magnetic anomalies, perceptual distortions from isolation and stress, but that your survey work itself is sound. The coordinates might have minor errors, but they're within acceptable tolerances for historic boundary reconciliation. It's not about tolerances. The landscape actively resists mapping. Thornton documented it. I experienced it. We're about to authorize a land transaction based on boundaries that don't actually exist in any stable sense. I need you to understand something, Margaret said, her tone shifting to something more formal. If you continue to insist that the survey is fundamentally flawed, I'll have to remove you from the project and assign it to another cartographer for peer review. That review will go in your permanent file and will raise questions about all your previous work. Your professional reputation will be affected. The threat was clear, but also entirely reasonable from her perspective. A senior cartographer claiming that landscapes could resist mapping, that coordinates could shift, that time could distort. These weren't the claims of a reliable professional. These were red flags suggesting mental health issues or competence problems that would have to be addressed through official channels. "I'm telling you the truth," I said. "Something is wrong with that area. Please, just delay the transaction until we can get more people out there. Other surveyors, geologists, maybe some specialists in geodesy. Let them verify my findings." That would cost tens of thousands of dollars and delay the transaction by at least 6 months. Based on what evidence? Your subjective experience of disorientation. A notebook you claim to have found but which contradicts its apparent age. GPS tracks that form patterns you interpret as messages. When she put it that way, I could hear how weak my case sounded. I had evidence of anomalies, but all of it could be explained by equipment malfunction, perceptual error, or psychological distress. The only truly inexplicable element was Thornton's notebook, and even that could be rationalized as a more recent document that I'd misidentified due to stress and isolation. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally. "I want you to take your full week of leave, rest, and come back to the office ready to certify your survey. Or, if you can't do that in good conscience, I want you to formally recuse yourself from the project and let someone else complete the review. Those are your options." She hung up before I could respond. I spent the next 2 days trying to decide what to do. My professional ethics demanded that I refuse to certify a survey I knew to be fundamentally flawed. But my professional reputation and livelihood depended on being able to work within the standard frameworks of my field, and those frameworks had no accommodation for landscapes that shifted, coordinates that moved, or time that distorted. If I refused certification, I'd be ending my career. Margaret would have me removed from the project. The peer review would find my concerns unsubstantiated, and I'd be left with a documented history of refusing to complete work based on claims that my colleagues found incredible. Future employers would see that history and conclude I was unreliable. If I certified the survey, I'd be doing exactly what Thornton had done. Creating documents I knew to be compromised, perpetuating a fiction that would cause problems for future surveyors, and potentially harming whoever tried to use those boundaries for legal or administrative purposes. The choice should have been clear. Professional ethics should have outweighed personal consequences, but I found myself thinking about Thornton's inscription on the rock wall. "May God forgive me if I have laid claim to something that was never mine to mark." He'd completed his survey despite knowing it was wrong. He'd created documents that entered the official record, and then he'd spent the rest of his life, or at least the part of it documented in his notebook, trying to warn others away. Maybe that was the real choice, not between certifying and refusing, but between completing the work and living with the consequences. Thornton had chosen to complete the work and then spend years trying to mitigate the damage. I could do the same. I could certify the survey, allow the land exchange to proceed, and then spend whatever time I had left trying to ensure that future surveyors understood what they were dealing with. On the morning of my 7th day of leave, I returned to the office and told Margaret I was ready to certify the survey. She looked relieved, then concerned, then finally resigned. "You're sure about this?" "No," I said honestly. but I understand that my concerns aren't sufficient to halt the transaction. The work is technically competent. If the Bureau of Land Management and the Ranching Corporation accept it, I have no grounds to refuse certification. That's very professional of you, she said, and I could hear in her tone that she understood what this was costing me. I signed the certification documents that afternoon. My signature was steady, my handwriting was clear, and the words I wrote committed me to the position that the survey was accurate and suitable for its intended purpose. I was lying, and everyone involved would eventually discover I was lying. But by then the transaction would be complete, and I would have moved on to other projects and other landscapes that hopefully behaved according to the normal rules. The land exchange was finalized 3 weeks later. The Bureau of Land Management transferred 4,700 acres to the Bridgewater Ranching Corporation in exchange for parcels in other locations that consolidated federal holdings. The transaction was routine, unremarkable, and legally sound. The coordinates I'd provided were entered into official databases and would serve as the authoritative boundary definition for the foreseeable future. I tried to move on. I took new assignments, conducted surveys in other states, threw myself into work with the kind of focused intensity that prevents thinking about things you'd rather not consider. And for 3 months, it seemed like I'd made the right choice. The Howling Creek area faded into my professional past, becoming just another completed project, interesting primarily for the challenging field conditions and magnetic anomalies that had made it difficult. Then I started receiving the calls. The first one came in January, from a surveyor named Patricia Chen who'd been hired by Bridgewater Ranching to subdivide their newly acquired property for estate planning purposes. She needed to locate my monuments as control points for her survey, and she was having trouble finding them. "The coordinates you provided are off by almost 400 meters, she said, frustration evident in her voice. "I've searched the entire area and found one of your monuments, but it's nowhere near where your plat says it should be." "That's not possible," I said, even though I knew it was not only possible but inevitable. I GPSed every monument location with dual-frequency receivers. The coordinates are accurate to within a few centimeters. "Well, they're not accurate now. And there's something else weird. My compass readings are all over the place, and I keep feeling like I'm walking in circles even though my GPS shows I'm traveling in straight lines. Have you ever experienced anything like that in your work?" I closed my eyes and felt the familiar weight of consequences settling onto my shoulders. "How long have you been on site?" 3 days. Why?" "Get out. Now. Tell your client you need to bring in specialized equipment for the magnetic anomalies. Don't stay out there longer than absolutely necessary." There was a long pause. "David, what happened to you when you were surveying this area?" "I lost 8 days, I said. "I have survey documents I don't remember creating. And the landscape," I stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane. "The landscape doesn't behave the way landscapes are supposed to behave. You need to leave while you still remember why you went there." She hung up without saying goodbye. The second call came a week later from a different surveyor, Michael Torres, hired by the Bureau of Land Management to verify fence lines along the new boundary. He reported the same problems: monuments in wrong locations, compass failures, perceptual distortions. And he mentioned something that Patricia Chen hadn't. He'd found cairns, lines of deliberately stacked stones that seemed to mark paths through the survey area, appearing and disappearing as he traveled. "Did you build those cairns during your original survey?" he asked. No, I lied, because the truth was I couldn't remember whether I had or hadn't during the 8 missing days. The third call came in February from the Bridgewater Ranching Corporation's attorney. There was a dispute about the boundary location. Neighboring ranchers claimed the new fence line was encroaching on their property. Could I provide additional documentation about how I'd established the corner monuments? I provided everything I had: field notes, photographs, GPS track logs, and hoped it would be sufficient. But I knew it wouldn't resolve the fundamental problem. The boundaries I'd mapped existed on paper, but not in any stable sense on the ground. The monuments would continue to shift, the coordinates would continue to change, and every attempt to verify or resurvey would generate new conflicts and confusion. By March, I'd received 14 calls about the Howling Creek survey. Surveyors reporting impossible conditions, attorneys demanding explanations, land managers requesting additional field work, everyone describing the same phenomena I'd experienced: compass failures, GPS anomalies, perceptual distortions, and the growing conviction that something about the landscape actively resisted measurement. And every person who spent time in the survey area reported the same pattern: initial disorientation, missing time, and work they couldn't remember completing. One surveyor had apparently spent 6 days in the field and could only remember 2. Another had created detailed maps of areas she'd never visited. A third had started keeping a journal to track her experiences and found entries in her own handwriting describing events she had no memory of witnessing. The area was affecting everyone who tried to survey it, using their skills and training to create more documentation, more boundaries, more elaborate frameworks of ownership and control that had no stable relationship to the physical landscape. And with each new survey, the problem seemed to be spreading. Adjacent parcels were starting to show coordinate discrepancies, and surveyors working in areas 10 or 15 miles away were reporting minor compass irregularities that matched the patterns I documented. By April, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Whatever I'd done by completing the survey, whatever Thornton had started in 1889, and I'd continued in 2025, was expanding. The wrongness was spreading outward from the original survey area, creating a zone of geodetic instability that grew larger with each attempt to map or measure it. I tried to get meetings with my supervisors, tried to present evidence that something unprecedented was happening in eastern Oregon, tried to convince anyone in the federal bureaucracy that we needed to stop surveying the area and start studying it as a phenomenon, rather than treating it as ordinary terrain that was simply difficult to map. Nobody wanted to hear it. The surveys had been expensive. The land exchange had been politically sensitive. Admitting that the entire project was fundamentally flawed would require unwinding legal transactions, refunding money, and acknowledging that something in an obscure corner of Oregon was behaving in ways that violated basic principles of geodesy and cartography. So the official position became that the area had unusual magnetic properties that made surveying challenging, but not impossible. Standard protocols were updated to recommend additional GPS verification and redundant measurements. Surveyors were warned to expect difficult conditions, but were assured that with proper equipment and technique, accurate surveys could be completed. And the zone of instability continued to expand. By June, I'd stopped answering calls about the Howling Creek survey. I'd provided all the documentation I could, answered all the questions I was able to answer, and there was nothing more I could offer except the truth, and the truth would end my career and help no one. So I let the calls go to voicemail and tried to focus on other work in other places where landscapes behaved according to the normal rules. But I couldn't stop thinking about Thornton's inscription. The survey is never finished because the land is never still. He'd recognized that attempting to map this place was a fundamental error, that imposing coordinates on it caused some kind of harm or distortion that perpetuated itself. And he'd completed the survey anyway, just as I had, creating documents that locked future generations into continuing relationship with a landscape that refused to be known. In July, I finally received the call I'd been expecting, Margaret Castellanos, informing me that the USGS was conducting an official review of my work on the Howling Creek survey. Multiple complaints had been filed. Discrepancies had been documented. Questions had been raised about my competence and professional conduct. They're going to interview everyone who's worked in that area, she said. They're going to review all the technical documentation, and they're going to ask you to explain why your survey has created so many problems. What do I tell them? I asked. The truth, she said, whatever that is. So I prepared a report, not the sanitized technical document that would protect my career, but the actual truth about what I'd experienced and what I understood to be happening. I included Thornton's notebook, my field notes from the days I remembered, the survey documents from the days I didn't remember, and GPS tracks that spelled out messages I hadn't intentionally written. I documented every anomaly, every impossibility, every moment when the landscape had demonstrated that it operated according to principles that transcended normal geodetic frameworks. I submitted the report in August and was placed on administrative leave while the review board considered their findings. The review took 6 weeks. During that time, I stayed in my apartment and monitored news from Eastern Oregon, watching as reports accumulated of surveying problems, boundary disputes, and strange phenomena in areas that had previously been unremarkable. The zone of instability had grown to encompass roughly 60 square miles, and it was still expanding. Surveyors who worked in the affected area reported missing time, compass failures, and the persistent sense that they were being used to accomplish purposes they didn't understand. In late September, I received the review board's decision. My survey was found to be technically competent, but operationally compromised by conditions I'd failed to properly document or report. I was reprimanded for poor judgment in certifying the survey despite recognizing significant anomalies. My professional credentials were suspended for 1 year, during which time I was required to undergo remedial training and psychological evaluation. The reprimand was lenient, all things considered. They could have terminated my employment and revoked my credentials permanently. Instead, they'd given me a path back to professional status, contingent on acknowledging that I'd made errors in judgment and accepting their interpretation of events as equipment malfunction and stress-related perceptual distortion. I accepted the reprimand because I had no other options. I never returned to work. During my suspension, I spent my time researching historical land surveys in the western United States, looking for other cases where surveyors had documented unusual phenomena or reported conditions that made accurate mapping impossible. I found dozens of examples, surveys from the 1880s that mentioned land that resists measurement, field notes describing compass failures and perceptual distortions, Accounts of surveyors experiencing missing time or creating documents they couldn't remember producing. The pattern was consistent across multiple locations and time periods. Certain landscapes resisted cartographic appropriation. When surveyors attempted to impose coordinate systems on these places, the places responded by creating instabilities that made surveying progressively more difficult. And every completed survey seemed to spread the instability outward, creating larger zones where normal geodetic principles broke down. It was as if the land itself had an immune response to mapping, a way of protecting itself from the kind of systematic comprehension that surveying represented. And we've been triggering that response for more than a century, creating a growing network of unstable zones across the western United States where coordinates shifted, time distorted, and anyone who tried to measure distance or bearing found themselves operating in spaces that refused to be known. I compiled all my research into a manuscript that I initially thought I might publish as a warning to other surveyors. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that publishing would only spread awareness of the phenomenon, which would lead to more surveys, more attempts to measure and document, more expansion of the instability zones. The responsible action was to keep the information private and hope that eventually the surveying profession would recognize the pattern on their own and develop protocols for identifying and avoiding these areas. That was 18 months ago. I still live in Denver, still have my credentials suspended, still spend my days researching historical surveys and tracking reports of geodetic anomalies. The Howling Creek Zone has grown to encompass more than 200 square miles and is now affecting communities, infrastructure, and land management across a significant portion of eastern Oregon. The Bureau of Land Management has restricted access to the area while they study the unusual magnetic phenomena. But I know the restrictions won't help because the problem isn't magnetic. The problem is that we tried to own something that was never meant to be owned, to measure something that exists outside the frameworks of measurement. Thornton understood this in 1889. I understand it now. And every surveyor who works in that area eventually comes to the same understanding, usually after spending days or weeks creating documents they don't remember producing, walking paths they don't remember choosing, serving purposes they don't understand. The survey is never finished because the land is never still. And by insisting on mapping it anyway, by creating documents that pretend stability exists where it doesn't, we've done something that Thornton feared and I've confirmed. We've injured the landscape in ways that propagate outward, creating larger and larger zones where human attempts at comprehension and control break down. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if it can be fixed. All I know is that somewhere in eastern Oregon, there's a spring at the bottom of a ravine where Thornton left his surveying instruments as an offering or an apology. And carved into the rock beside that spring is my name and a date that hasn't happened yet. September 2026. In 3 months, I'll return to Howling Creek. Not because I want to, but because something in that landscape has been directing my path since the moment I arrived there. And I understand now that the survey was never my work. It was the landscape working through me, using my hands to create the documents it needed to ensure that others would come, would experience what I experienced, would contribute to whatever purpose these shifting geometries serve. The cairns led me to the spring. The spring gave me Thornton's notebook. The notebook showed me that this pattern extends backward through time to at least 1889 and probably further. And now, the inscription bearing my name, suggests the pattern extends forward into a future where I'll return to that ravine and do something I can't yet imagine, completing a cycle that I unwittingly entered when I accepted an assignment to survey boundaries in a place where boundaries cannot exist. I tell you this not as a warning, because warnings imply choices, and I'm no longer certain that anyone who encounters these landscapes has actual choices. The land decides what it needs, and we serve those needs whether we understand them or not. Instead, I tell you this as documentation, a record of what happens when cartographers attempt to map the unmappable, when professional obligations override recognition of impossibility, when we insist on completing surveys that should never be started. The Howling Creek area remains officially unmapped in any meaningful sense. The coordinates I provided are wrong. The monuments I established have moved or disappeared. The boundaries I certified don't exist in any stable form. And somewhere in the growing zone of instability, cairns are appearing along paths that future surveyors will follow, leading them deeper into landscape that treats human comprehension as something to be absorbed and redirected rather than acknowledged and accommodated. If you work in surveying or cartography, if you're ever assigned to projects in remote areas where previous surveys have documented unusual conditions, compass failures, coordinate discrepancies, perceptual distortions, I encourage you to decline the work. The professional consequences of refusal are manageable. The consequences of acceptance are permanent. I didn't decline. Thornton didn't decline. And now we're both part of something larger than ourselves, serving purposes we don't understand, waiting for the dates carved into stone that tell us when we'll return to complete the next phase of whatever process these landscapes are conducting through our bodies and our professional skills. The land requires nothing from us but absence, Thornton wrote. He was right. But by the time you understand that truth, you're already too present, too mapped, too integrated into systems that extend backward and forward through time in ways that make the concept of personal choice seem almost laughably inadequate. In 3 months, I'll return to the spring. I'll read whatever new inscriptions have appeared on the stone. I'll probably complete whatever task the landscape has prepared for me during the intervening year. And then, if the pattern holds, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to warn others away from places they'll inevitably go anyway, because the land decides who comes and who stays and who serves its purposes. That's what I learned in Howling Creek. Not cartography, not geodesy, not any principle of measurement or boundary determination. Just the simple, terrible understanding that some places refuse to be known, and when we insist on knowing them anyway, we become part of their unknowability, extensions of their resistance to comprehension, tools serving purposes we can neither understand nor escape. The survey is never finished. The land is never still. And somewhere in eastern Oregon, my name is carved in stone beside a date that draws closer each day, marking an appointment I'll keep, because I no longer have the ability to refuse.